Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism. My goal is that help you understand these relationships, these patterns, these black holes you can fall in, and give you the tools to navigate your way out, ideally not navigate your way in, and try to figure out ways to heal from these relationships, hard as it may be. But those of you who want to do a deeper dive into healing, please go to the video notes. We do have a very robust healing program if you want to check that out. And if you're new to this channel, please subscribe, because the combination of not only hearing the content, but reading the comments can give you some real insights into the who, what, where, when, and why of these relationships. And so we're going to do a little bit of why today. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding the why and not letting it hurt you. This is a unique series because this series is meant to help both people living with the narcissistic personalities and the people who are hurt by them. Usually I don't put both of those in the same video, right? Because one of the hardest things to talk about when it comes to narcissism is the why. Where does it come from? Why are folks like this? I know everyone wants to know the why, but the problem with the why is understanding the why can leave people more confused, more trauma bonded, and then people end up making more and more justifications for narcissistic behavior and these relationships. You know my hard line on this. I don't care what a person's backstory is. If you abuse someone, there is no excuse for it. Done. Everyone has something. Lashing out is not an option. If you feel that you need to lash out, walk away, find a more appropriate outlet, but it is not acceptable to abuse another person because of stuff you need to get straight in yourself. So this is a series on working backwards so you can keep moving forwards. To help people who they themselves, if you think you have narcissistic patterns, better help understand yourself and hopefully stop taking it out on other people. And for people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse, to better understand these processes and origins with the goal of not justifying so much. Now, today, we're going to take on narcissistic patterns that often trace back to trauma earlier in life or into adolescence or early adulthood. One of the most difficult things about understanding narcissism is how diverse the pathways are to get to this narcissistic personality. At the core of all of these patterns is clearly something biological that we still don't fully understand. It largely appears to be a temperament by environment interaction, and that temperament is biologically determined and inborn. And the issues we will take on in this series are the environmental things that will often turn on that temperament and take it down a more narcissistic path. And even with the temperament and the environment interaction, that temperament may still not turn into adult narcissism. And in some cases, when we tell the story backwards, it just doesn't add up, meaning that we can't figure out quite what led to a person's narcissism. But in the vast majority of cases, the pieces do make sense. We can tell this story. So let's start from the very top with trauma. Why is trauma associated with narcissism? And what does a more post-traumatic narcissism look like? Please keep in mind, not all trauma histories are associated with narcissism, and not all narcissistic people have histories of trauma. Please remember that. But trauma, especially while the brain is still developing quickly, which is infancy, kind of through emerging adulthood, impacts how a person processes the world, how they feel the world. Post-trauma is characterized by patterns like vigilance and fear and threat perception and impulsivity and poorly managed emotion, either too much or too little, and re-experiencing and avoidance. Trauma can be seen in the histories of a not insignificant number of narcissistic individuals, and often shows up most often in people with vulnerable and sometimes malignant narcissistic patterns. In narcissistic people with trauma histories behind them, we can see the constant perceptions of threat to the point of what almost looks like paranoia, and this thin-skinned aggression in the face of provocation, the limited empathy, the impulsivity, all very much can track back to early trauma histories. Then, if the trauma was perpetrated by family members, especially parents or older siblings, or through witnessing domestic violence, then deviant, cruel behavior was also modeled by these people and may show up in the behavior of the narcissistic person in adulthood who is in essence repeating what they saw. For folks with these histories, with trauma histories, if they go to therapy, ideally there is trauma-informed work happening, somatic work, the series of best practices in trauma. Unfortunately, once the therapeutic work becomes emotionally vulnerable, narcissistic folks tend to drop out of therapy and the beat goes on. Post-traumatic narcissistic patterns can be really problematic. Lots of suspiciousness, bordering on paranoia, aggressiveness, menace, manipulation. It does not feel safe for the other person in the relationship with the narcissistic person. The challenge is that when someone in a relationship with a narcissistic person who has a trauma history learns that that trauma history may have contributed to that person's narcissistic personality pattern, there are tons and tons of cognitive dissonance. First, the trauma actually makes sense as a way to make sense of such a hostile and difficult pattern. And the idea that if you stepped away, you would be one more person who is harming them. But also, if you stand up to them, that you have to endure their rage, and that can feel scary. Many times, when a person recognizes that a partner or other significant person in their life has a trauma history, there's a strong sense of guilt that in some ways it may just have to be your lot in life to have to just put up and shut up because they, the narcissistic person, had their own burdens to carry, and you don't want to add to that. But here's the deal. It is not your role to act as the punching bag and regulation tool for a person who is always managing rage and suspiciousness and is impulsive in their words and behavior. You are not responsible for their history, and frankly, you enduring their BS is not helping them either, though they will lash out at you in a way that may leave you feeling as though you have done something wrong for not enduring their behavior. You can't win. And if they are not getting help, such as therapy, and instead are getting through their days by bullying you and everyone else, again, not acceptable. It is painful to know that their histories and legacies have harmed them so much. That's an empathic reaction. And being an adult, though, for them means making the choice to do something about it. For them to take responsibility to recognize that their behavior is unacceptable, they have to recognize that and then grow up and take that responsibility. Or they just have to be accountable and leave relationships where they are doing so much harm. They don't get to have it both ways. It can get very tricky if they use their histories in a manipulative manner, especially when they recognize that such a strategy is working. They'll say things like, I had such a tough childhood. I watched my dad beat up my mom. I was assaulted. And hearing those things keeps you stuck. After a while, they know they can pull out that card and get you to not leave or hold them behaviorally accountable or just put up with them. That's not a relationship, folks. That is psychological imprisonment. Of all the narcissistic backstories, or origins backstories, I should say, I do believe that this results in some of the more severe narcissistic symptomatology for people who do have narcissistic personalities, and results in the most cognitive dissonance for survivors. But there's one last thing you need to remember. The majority of people who endure trauma in childhood and adolescence do not develop adult narcissistic personalities. So it's not a given. And many of those folks who have experienced trauma either did the hard work of therapy or may have had very, very different temperaments. However, when a person's narcissistic behavior has trauma in the backstory, it makes it very hard for narcissistic abuse survivors and for the person with the narcissistic personality style as well. It's just a tough one. There are therapists out there who are very, very skilled and specialized at trauma work, and it is painful, difficult work, but it's important work. If you believe you have a narcissistic personality style, and you think it relates to your trauma history, please look into it, because lashing out at others because of that is not a path forward to you. And addressing the trauma is essential to living a more whole life. If you are in a relationship with someone who is narcissistic and has an earlier life history of trauma, ensure you have supports and ideally therapy for yourself. If you're concerned that there are safety issues in this relationship, we will have resources for that in the video notes, and your staying in the relationship may help you in the way of not having to grapple with the guilt. But let me tell you, that's not good for you, because it's not doing you, the other person, and others who are caught in the blast zone of this relationship and of this person's behavior any favors. I will say it again and again. There is no excuse for abuse. There are explanations, but there's no excuse. There is no backstory that makes it okay. These explanations may give us a structure within which to understand it, but not to sign off on it. So understanding origin, I know it's something that's so compelling, but that origin cannot be used as a tool of self-blame for survivors or an excuse for behavior by people who are narcissistic. All of this is about stepping up and taking responsibility, painful as it may be. Thanks again.